So, to me, what the image on the right looks like is, first of all, it's like the ancestral home of human beings for tens of millions of years, or our ancestors. And so that's the tree with the snake. It's like the primary human environment maybe 60 million years ago. It's not human at that level, but it's part of our evolutionary heritage. And it's also part of why we have a sense, especially that large trees are sort of sacred. That's one of the senses that drives environmentalism, for example, because environmentalists are often very interested in protecting old-growth forests, which is actually kind of weird, because old-growth forests are ready to burn down, and they're also kind of biologically dead. There's no light can get to the bottom, and nothing grows down there, so they're just trees, and they're almost dead trees. So, you know, from the perspective of biological diversity, they're not really that fruitful an environment. But human beings still have some real kinship with those gigantic trees, and we feel that there's something, you know, natural and sacred about them. So superimposed on that is, I think, something like the next stage of human evolution. And so, you know, these representations were made by people who were trying to represent sort of the ultimate reality of mankind. And so superimposed on the tree is a mountain. And a mountain is a nice representation of a pyramid, and a pyramid is a nice representation of a dominance hierarchy. Of course, I already mentioned to you that human beings live in dominance hierarchies and that they're a very permanent part of our environment, being at least 300 million years old, and possibly older than that. So when the human imagination is trying to conceptualize what constitutes ultimate reality, that's a reality that's often beyond what you can merely see, because the things you see that are directly in front of you are not necessarily the most real things, in that many of the things that you see are transforming fairly rapidly. They're not permanent in any real sense. I mean, automobiles you see all the time, but they've only been around for 80 years. You know, it's not like we've adapted biologically to their presence. So you have the mountain in the middle. And the mountain is sort of sitting in a circumscribed territory. And the idea there is that there's a dominance hierarchy that human beings inhabit, and it always occupies a particular territory. And the dominance hierarchy is like the culture, the place of culture that mankind exists within, that's surrounded by the chaos outside. And the chaos outside is represented by, well, there's two snakes in the picture on your right. The snake in the middle is an Ouroboros, which is a snake that eats its own tail. And it's representative of the chaos that's outside of the familiarity of your culture. And so it's a very, as we've mentioned already, it's a very intelligent perspective, because it says, well, mankind always lives in culture, and surrounding culture is the unknown, and that's the eternal habitat of man, so of human beings. So. And then I showed you this picture briefly, and that's the picture that was derived by a German researcher who was examining the visions of the Peruvian Amazonian Indians, the shaman, and you can see that it's almost staggeringly the same as the Scandinavian perspective, right down to the snake that eats its own tail, which, by the way, is an extremely common ancient symbol. So it's quite remarkable. Now, what might unite, and then I talked to you about my son's drawing. Didn't get to this one, though. Now, what might unite these different visions, say the Scandinavian vision and the Amazonian shamanic vision, are the methods that the people who had the visions used to induce them. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But first of all, I'm going to tell you about this picture, because I think this is one. There's a couple of variations of this picture that I found. I actually don't know its name, but I think it's one of the most amazing images I've ever come across, because in some ways it sums up Christianity in one picture, and that's no easy thing to do. And the reason I think it's important to talk about this Christian representation, for example, though we've already talked about some Taoist representations, is because insofar as we're embedded in westernized civilization, the roots of westernized civilization they push themselves down into Christianity, and then there's deeper substrata under that, the religious structures that preceded Christianity. But if you want to understand the Western notions of the person and the ideal person as well, you have to look at the structure of the systems that Western civilization grew out of, because the religious systems, for example, are the systems in which the idea of the ideal emerged. And so you can't come to grips with the idea of the ideal, or the idea of mental health, which is an ideal, without understanding the ground out of which these ideas emerged. You can't come to terms with it in any fundamental sense. And the thing is, if you're doing clinical psychology, for example, you have to come to terms with it in a fundamental sense, because a lot of the time when people come and see you, the reason they come and see you is because their sense of life's meaning has been shattered And they're unable to proceed without the restoration of that meaning. So maybe their belief systems fell apart and they face some sort of tragedy that's just blown them into pieces. And they have no idea how to orient themselves. Because life always presents an existential question, and one that we'll deal with later, which is life is difficult and it's characterized by suffering. And because of that, there has to be a reason to stand up against that. And so the reason has to be made coherent. So you have to know, in some sense, that you're the sort of creature that can voluntarily face the tragic conditions of existence and prevail. And that's a religious presupposition, fundamentally, because it's based on, it's a hypothesis in some sense, that human beings are like that. So let me tell you about this image, because it's a staggering image. It's so brilliant. So the first thing you'll notice is that, of course, there's a tree in the middle of it, and it sort of looks like the tree that, you know, a little kid would draw. They sort of look like lollipops or something like that. So it's a schematized tree. And you'll see, of course, that the snake is wrapped around the tree. The snake and the tree seem to come along together unbelievably often. So Asclepius's rod, for example, Asclepius is the Greek god of healing. And you see the symbol of the Greek god of healing, which is Asclepius's rod, is still used to represent physicians. And it's a rod with a snake wrapped around it too. And the snake represents transformation because it can die and it can shed its skin and sort of be reborn. And for many other reasons besides. But in this representation, which is partly derived from Genesis and then partly derived from the development of Christian ideas for thousands of years after that, there's a particular idea that's being portrayed. Now, you notice that up in the tree, there are little things that look like fruit, and one of those things is a skull, right? Now, so the idea there is that the fruit that the tree produced is in some manner equivalent to death. Now, in the Genesis story, what happens is that Eve tempts Adam with the fruit from the tree. So she offers him this fruit. Now, that's a very interesting thing, because women, historically speaking, have been gatherers. Like men do the hunting, generally speaking, in archaic societies, and women do the gathering. And human beings have also subsisted for large parts of their evolutionary history, before we were human beings, as frugivores. We ate fruit. And the reason we have color vision, by the way, is so that we can detect ripe fruit. And ripe fruit is also tightly associated with sexuality. So like if you look through the ads in women's magazines, the makeup ads, the associations between ripeness and fruit and, say, women's cheeks and women's lips are always they're much put forward. You know, and so there's a tight association between sexuality and food, and for a variety of reasons. But so Eve basically tempts Adam, in some sense, into a conscious relationship with her by offering him food. And in the case of the Genesis story, it's ripe fruit. And so it's an enticement. And she also entices him into self-consciousness, which is quite interesting, because number one, women do make men self-conscious. I mean, that's sort of an ultimate truth of the nature of the relationship between men and women. And rejection in particular is something that makes men self-conscious, and they're much more exposed to that than women are in the sort of sexual dance, because women are sort of, on average, quite successful at seeking out sexual encounters, where men are, on average, very unsuccessful at doing the same thing. So they suffer a lot of rejection. It's a very fundamental form of rejection, right? It's like, well, you're good enough to maybe tolerate being alive and all that, but your genetic material should by no means be allowed to, move itself into the future. It's a really fundamental form of rejection, and the rejection is, well, you don't measure up, and that's certainly the ground of self-consciousness. And so there's a lot of weird things tangled up together in the Genesis story. So Eve gives Adam the fruit, and what happens is that wakes him up. What the story says is that the scales fall from his eyes, and then the first thing that happens is he realizes he's naked. And that's a very interesting kind of realization, because one of the very common nightmares that people have is that they're naked in front of a crowd. So you might say, well, what does it mean to be naked in front of a crowd? Well, it means to have your vulnerability exposed to the arbitrary judgment of the cultural mass. It's a nightmare for most people. And human beings are very weird animals, because most animals wander around on four legs, and of course, that means the armored part of their body is what shows, right? Their spine and their ribs along the back, which is pretty tough and hard. But human beings are standing up. So the most vulnerable parts of our body are broadcast straight forward. So when human beings woke up during our evolutionary, progress towards the kind of consciousness we have, when we became self-conscious, that was essentially equivalent to recognizing our naked vulnerability. And that's what the Genesis story is trying to relate. You know, and it also points out that it says snakes, women, and fruit played an integral role in the development of human self-consciousness. And so here, the fruit that's being eaten is equivalent to death, and that's why there's a skull in the tree. And so, because what happened was when people became self-conscious, like consciously self-conscious, we started to understand the full nature of our vulnerability. And so what does that mean? Well, for human beings, in part, it meant that we discovered time. And that's a great thing to discover, because then it means you have the future to think about. But it's also an absolute bloody catastrophe, because you also understand that the future is finite, and that your life is bounded, and that you will end. And as far as we know, human beings are the only creatures that have to contend with that knowledge. And once you have it, like once you wake up like that, there's no going back to sleep. Like, it's a qualitative transformation in the nature of experience. And, you know, the Genesis story pushes the idea farther. It says the fact that we've woken up and are aware of our vulnerability is also what makes us fallen creatures. It makes us alienated from existence in a way that animals aren't. And so what that also means, and this is sort of an existential idea, is that the rise of self-consciousness in that manner, which is in part the knowledge of death, is also what's made people... well, one of the things that happens, for example, in Genesis is, it's quite a funny story. So Eve makes Adam all self-conscious, and then they wander off and cover themselves up, right? Which is sort of the first entry of cultural artifacts into the paradisal state. It's right. The first thing you do once you realize you're naked is cover yourself up. Now, you know, that story is often interpreted in a sexual way, and there's elements of that, but it's more pragmatic. It's like, yeah, once you figure out that you're naked and that you're going to freeze to death and that it's cold in the future, it's like the first thing you do is cover yourself up. You know, and people have been wearing clothes for a very long time. We've been wearing clothes for so long that body lice are adapted to clothing. And so it's been tens of thousands of years. So, you know, and obviously human beings are also the only creatures that wear clothes, which is, you know, and it's a human universal, by the way. People wear clothes everywhere, virtually everywhere that human beings have been discovered. So you cover yourself up, and that's the first indication that you're aware of your vulnerability. But you're also aware of the necessity of taking care of yourself as a, you know, as a separate entity, which animals don't really seem to have that notion. I mean, they get hungry and all that, but it's not obvious that they, you know, that they can extend the idea of hunger into the future, so that, you know, so that they're caring about times that are not here yet. Now, what happens after people become self-conscious? They cover themselves up, and then God comes into the garden, which he's always doing, to have a walk with Adam, and Adam can't be found. And so God says, you know, well, you know, where are you? You know, what are you doing? Hiding away. And Adam's cowering behind a bush, which is really stupid. He's there with Eve, you know, thinking, I suppose, that God can't see through the bush, or whatever it is that he's thinking. And, you know, he makes a case that God asks him what in the world he's doing hiding, and he says, well, I'm naked. And God says, well, you know, how do you figure that out? And of course, Adam, being the heroic figure he is, immediately points to Eve and says, well, it was the woman's fault. You made her for me, but, you know, it was her that tempted me. So it's really quite a comical story. It's often being read by sort of patriarchal Christian interpreters as a story that implicates Eve in the initial destruction of mankind. But from my way of reading it, it's just as hard on Adam, or even worse, because he's such a cringing coward when things really start to go wrong. I mean, the first thing he does is hide, because he's naked. And the second thing he does, as soon as he's pushed on it a bit, it's like, it's your fault, it's your fault. You know, he won't take responsibility for it. And that's also an extremely complex story, because one of the things it implies, it's a brilliant idea, is that, like, if you can imagine metaphorically that walking with God means something like, you know, staying in close contact with the divine nature of being, or something like that, and having ultimate faith in the positive nature of reality, things that might be damaged if you became self-conscious. Well, why would you stop believing in that, which would be to stop walking with God? And the answer to that is, well, you become aware of your own vulnerability and your own, you know, finiteness, and that makes you afraid, so you hide. And that is what people do. They do that all the time. It's a chronic state of human existence that in many ways you hide from the best parts of yourself. And I mean, adolescence is usually like the painful acting out of that process over a protracted period of time. And people often never really recover from that. They won't bring their best forward because they're afraid. You know, and they're afraid for good reason. And so God says, oh, well, now you've done it, we can't undo this, and so now out you go, you're not going to be in paradise anymore, which means you're no longer going to be unconscious like a happy child. It's like you've screwed up completely. You know you're finite. Now you're going to have to work because now you're aware of the future, and so you know all these things that can go wrong, so you're going to have to work because you realize that the future could be dangerous, so you have to fix things up. And he tells the women that they're going to suffer dreadfully in childbirth. It's very interesting because there's a reason that women suffer in childbirth, and the reason for that is that your child's heads are too big. I told you about that the last time we met. And so the story there also associates cortical expansion with self-consciousness and with the difficulty of birth. It's a bloody brilliant story. It's just unbelievable how much information is packed into it. And then that's very characteristic of archetypal stories. It also helps you see how another manifestation of the kind of tree symbolism, say, that's characteristic of the Scandinavian stories and the Peruvian Amazonian stories, and the role of snake plays. No trees without snakes. No paradise without snakes. No ability of mankind to ever produce a bounded environment that's safe without something chaotic managing to come inside of it. There's no way you can do it. It's a very paradoxical element of existence. So that's pretty interesting. So that's what's happening with Eve on the right side of the picture. You see the skeleton at the back there representing death. And so that's good old Eve. And then on the left side here, you have the embodiment of the church and the Christian tradition. Now she's also handing out things that are from the tree. And so this is like that the religious stories in general are stories about tragedy and redemption. That's sort of what makes them religious stories. It's like they outline the terrible things that can happen to you, like in the most brutal possible way, and then they provide a theory about a mode of being that might help you address that. So that's the redemptive part. And so the redemptive part here is, you see, in the tree, there's also a crucifix. It's sort of the counterpart to the skull. And in the tree, there are all these little fruits, and some of them are obviously the apple skulls that Eve are handing out. But what they are on the left-hand side are hosts. And the host is the little thing that Catholics eat during the Mass. And the host is, hypothetically, part of Christ's body. And so that's it's a derivative of the Last Supper. And there's an unbelievably archaic idea that lurks underneath that, because it's basically a cannibalistic ritual. And the idea is essentially that if you can identify something that's an ideal, and you can incorporate it, and you do that most basically by eating, because that's how you incorporate most basically, then that can become part of you. So you can take on the attributes of something by incorporating it. And so part of the Christian drama is an attempt to inculcate in its followers the idea that you should imitate the ultimate ideal. The question is, well, what's the ultimate ideal? Different religions handle that in different ways. So Buddha, for example, is an ultimate ideal for Buddhists, and Christ is an ultimate ideal for Christians. So then you might say, well, what exactly is this thing that's ideal? Okay, so the host is part of it. So partly it's the body of Christ, and partly it's a wheaten wafer. And the reason it's made out of wheat is because wheat was regarded as a dying and resurrecting crop, because it's a crop that, disappears in the fall and then comes back in the spring, like most agricultural crops do. So it's kind of an eternal miracle. So it's like the dying and resurrecting corn god. And so that's a pagan idea that's sort of assimilated to the Christian idea. And then there's something that's more profound underneath that, which is that the idea is that the part of the human spirit that can accept death and die and resurrect itself, which means to continually transform in the face of tragedy, is the thing that's the antidote to the painful catastrophe of self-consciousness. It's a staggering idea. I mean, I've studied personality theory for a long time, and the first thing that I've discovered in relationship to this is almost all the personality theories that we have that involve movement towards a state of improved health are predicated on the idea that people transform through a process of painful transformation. It's like dissolution of part of your personality, which is painful and chaotic, and then the reconstruction of that into a more fulfilled form. And the reason that's associated with acceptance of vulnerability is, again, it's brilliant. This is why humility is a virtue from the religious perspective, is that you cannot change until you admit that you're wrong and that part of you has to go. So you have part of admitting your insufficiency is being willing to sacrifice that insufficiency, to let it go, so that something new can rise out of the ashes. And sometimes that can be your whole personality, you know, to the degree that you're pathological in your fundamental structures, man. There may be things that you have to give up that are huge chunks of your life. So the alternative is to be in pain and suffering and misery, and you know, that can turn into cruelty and murderousness and things that are much, much more terrible than mere suffering. So that's the idea here. It's the whole story of human redemption in a single image. Mind-boggling. Brilliant. And you know, it took people thousands of years to think up this image, or maybe tens of thousands of years. So there's so much thought packed into that image that it's beyond, virtually beyond comprehension. It's a remarkable image.